Hi, everyone. So it's week 11, and we are talking about themes. As I mentioned in the announcement video for this week, I'm not going to talk as long about these two stories, and then the the excerpt is a little bit shorter as well, because I kind of want to see what you have to say in the discussion forum, and I don't want to give too many things away about what's happening with the themes in these stories. But for each one, I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown of what happens in the story, and I'll talk about what themes I'd like you to look for and kind of some of the techniques that the author uses to, the authors, both of them, use to convey these themes. So the first story is Recitative. It is by Toni Morrison. And the interesting thing about this story, in addition to the themes, sorry. In addition to the themes, it has quite an interesting point of view. And we are introduced to two girls, Twyla and Roberta. And we have scenes of the two of them and their friendship at different points in their lives. And so it starts off with Twyla and Roberta at an orphanage. It's not really an orphanage. It's more of like a foster care home, a group home, St. Bonnie's. Twyla's mother dances all night. Roberta's mother is sick. And they're initially introduced. They bond together. They form a friendship, even though they're of two different races. Now, which girl is white and which girl is black, we don't know. We're not told that by the author. And I think what's interesting in terms of technique is that she has this theme of race and racial differences and racial equality, and it has as much to do with what she's leaving out and not saying as it does with what she is saying. So that's something I would like you to kind of consider and look for. What could you, if you're trying to convey a theme, you don't have to hit your reader over the head with it. I guess that's the message there. So we jump several years forward, and we see 8 years ahead of time. Twyla is working at a Howard Johnson's, which is a restaurant on the Thruway. Now we're into the 1960s. There's a Greyhound bus that stops by the diner, and Roberta is among the passengers, and so we see them interact again. They're talking about Jimi Hendrix. They're talking about each other's families, and they're kind of having a very cold and distant conversation, in part likely because of the changes that are taking place in the country at that time. We jump 12 more years into the future. Twyla is married to a man named James, and she runs into Roberta, who is dressed quite elegantly, and she's also married and has stepchildren. So they both have children. They talk about this incident from their childhood, and they both remember it kind of differently. And then they start thinking about the racial strife and the integration and the segregation that was happening at that point in time. And so the two women kind of promise to keep in touch and part ways, and then we have another jump in time, and there is a protest, and we see them interact again. We jump further in time. Twyla's son is now in college. She sees Roberta. They have a very they kind of have small talk, and then they talk about this incident again from their childhood. So we have a very interesting, and I think a very realistic picture of what happens to a friendship as two people who are very different enjoy each other's company, but also might not have that much in common and kind of drift apart. So they're both mothers at one point. they're kind of rude and cold to each other. At another point, they're reminiscing. And before the days of social media and Facebook and things like that, where you could keep up with people that you were friends with when you were younger, I think it's an interesting way that she sets up this story. So the story is a short story, but it's a little bit longer than some of the other things we've read. It's about 20 pages long, but she packs quite a bit in, in terms of setting. There are several different settings. This story takes place over a very long period of time, and that kind of thing. But let's talk about some of the themes. I'm going to just read very briefly a couple lines here, and then I'm going to skip and read some more. So, my mother danced all night, and Roberta's was sick. That's why we were in St. Bonnie's. And then she skips down a little ways, and here's what she said. And again, we see her mother dancing, which is why I read that first line. The minute I walked in and the big bozo introduced us, I got sick to my stomach. It was one thing to be taken out of your bed early in the morning. It was something else to be stuck in a strange place with a girl from a whole other race. And Mary, that's my mother, she was right. Every now and then, she would stop dancing long enough to tell me something important. And one of the things she said was that they never washed their hair and they smelled funny. Roberta sure did. Smell funny, I mean. So when the big bozo, nobody ever called her Mrs. Itkin, it was just like nobody ever said St. Bonaventure, they called it Bonnie's. When she said, Twyla, this is Roberta, Roberta, this is Twyla, make each other welcome. I said, my mother won't like you putting me in here. Good, said Bozo, maybe she'll come and take you home. So we have, right from the opening paragraphs, a setup of what some of the themes in this story are going to be. And there's some debate with different authors. Some people think that you should have a theme in mind before you write, and you should have kind of a purpose other than just to entertain. Some people think that if you have a theme in mind, it limits your story. It comes across as forced. It comes across as didactic, kind of preaching or teaching at people a little bit more than focusing on the story itself. So I think it's interesting to see a story here where we have a pretty heavy theme of race and racial relations and an interracial friendship, but it is treated in such a way, especially with not knowing what race each girl is, it's treated in such a way that even though it's really integral to the story, I would not say it's didactic. And the reason for that is that the author has these themes, these large concepts, but she doesn't necessarily have a set message that she wants the reader to learn or think about or consider or understand. And so I think that is a pretty important piece. If you read this, your interpretation might be one thing, somebody else's interpretation might be another. You're going to think about the theme possibly of race in one way. Somebody else might think about the theme in a different way. And there are also more than one theme. There are many themes in this story. So we have, you can kind of see from the beginning, there's a lot of things about family here. The family that you have, the family that you create. There's a lot to be said here about friendship, both with children and as people kind of grow up and grow away from that friendship. We have people who are kind of outsiders. There's a woman, Maggie, who has a disability, so they return in those scenes I was kind of telling you about. They return to talking about that disability, and was she white or was she black? They can't remember. One person thinks one thing, one person thinks another thing, and again, those kind of slippery memories of childhood. How disabled people are treated, how outcasts are treated. Social class. We have Twyla working as a waitress. We have Roberta later on being dressed up sort of elegantly, right? Having a fancy car. We have certainly the ideas of racial prejudice and the tensions that were in the country at that time, specifically in the 50s and 60s during segregation, and then during the kind of the hippie movement, which we see a little bit of, and then coming into the 1980s where there are different types of protests going on, and they're both mothers, which is another theme. So what I would like you to do is read the story thinking about how even in a short number of pages, this is a story, not a book, though I think it could have been a book, but even in a short number of pages, how these themes are kind of woven together, and how disability and Maggie, she's a side character, so it's not the most prominent theme. I think motherhood, which comes later on in the story, again, not the most prominent theme, but how these kind of work together and interplay with each other, and the way that she is, the way that she's using these large abstract concepts when telling the story of these two women. Everyday Use by Alice Walker is a little bit shorter, so if you don't have time this week to read Recitative, you can read Everyday Use. And this is an interesting story that I think there's a little bit less shoved in here than there is in Recitative, which has so many themes. So what are we looking at? I'll give you a brief summary of the story first. So we have another Maggie in this story. So Maggie lives at home with her mother. She is her mother's oldest daughter. We have Dee, her mother's second daughter. And Maggie is described as being kind of homely. She has some burn scars, but she's lived with her mother. She very clearly has some bad self-esteem. So they're waiting for Dee to come home. When Dee comes home, she declares that Dee is dead, and she introduces herself as Wangaro, and has taken on a new name. She is with a man, and they are a little bit more urban, and this is a rural setting. So the man that she's with, she's calling Hakeem. Mama and Maggie don't know whether they're married or whether they're dating, whether they're traveling together. They decide not to ask. They have a meal together, and then Dee looks at these quilts that have been hand-pieced by Grandma Dee and by her mother, and by their ancestors. They've been hand stitched together, and she says that they're priceless and she should be the one to have them. And her mother also doesn't have the best self-esteem, looks over at Maggie and sees, Maggie is the one who is there washing these quilts every day and staying with the family and helping them. And she decides that Maggie should have the quilts. She offers Dee a machine stitched quilt, not quite as valuable in Dee's mind. And Dee, or Wangaro, she gets angry and says that her mother doesn't understand culture or heritage, and leaves. So the interesting things in this text, there are again a number of themes. The quilts themselves have quite a lot of symbolism, so you can kind of consider that. How are they described? What do they represent in this story? There's a lot of history with quilt making in the community that is being described here. That quilt making used to be a community activity. You would hand stitch pieces together, then you would come together as a community to put the quilt together and to do the actual quilting. It was an artistry, a handmade, homegrown type of artistry that women of that time period participated in. And so the question kind of becomes, who really appreciates the quilts? What does the culture mean to both of these girls? that one of them is talking about culture in kind of an abstract sense. Another one is living in this culture still, this very rural community where some of these activities are still going on. And they appreciate the quilts for different reasons. And again, I think here maybe the author has a little bit more of a clear message than in our first story, but the message isn't as important as just taking in the ideas of history and culture and family and all of the things that these quilts represent. There's this rural versus urban identity, but really we're looking at issues of family and loyalty and tradition and heritage and ownership and that kind of a thing. So in terms of the techniques she's using, I think what's interesting again is that the story is more prominent. The story is first and foremost. The themes are there, but they're not forced in. And so you kind of, it's like when we talked about info dumping with setting, you kind of see the themes unfolding as the story is being told. And some of these things are what they're eating, what the house looks like, how they're dressing, how they're interacting with each other, the way that her mother is talking about these things, the way that Dee changes her name, the person that she's traveling with and what he's like, all of that. So that is really what I'd like you to look at. How in this story the story comes first and the themes kind of, I think, come second. I think it's more about telling the story of Maggie and her mother and her sister than it is thumping you over the head with what you should think about culture and heritage and that kind of thing. So really briefly, Always Jessie is our sample for this week. And it's interesting that I kept this because I couldn't find my first draft, but I had deleted scenes. I guess I didn't change too much in terms of large scale changes for this book, except that I had a couple chapters like the one I'm presenting you guys where Jessie had a boyfriend. So context, this book is about a girl who's 15 or 16, and she has an eating disorder. The first third of the book, quarter of the book is her struggling with the eating disorder. She goes to get help, and then the rest of the book is her journey toward working toward recovery, even though recovery from eating disorders takes a very long time, which it talks about in the book too. So she goes into an inpatient facility and then gets help at that time and begins to recover. So the issue with her having a boyfriend is that it did not work. That's what it basically comes down to. I wanted a lot of people with eating disorders who are that age have difficulty with intimate, close relationships, not necessarily sexual relationships, but close relationships. And they have such a focus on appearance and some of the eating disorder behavior. Jessie's a runner. It's hard to have a boyfriend if you're trying to keep straight A's and you're running 4 hours a day. And then also she has sisters that she's taking care of. So I didn't know time-wise, does it fit in her schedule to be dating somebody? But more importantly, it just didn't seem to fit with the themes of the book. We have some scenes in the beginning of the book where she's struggling to kind of maintain these like frenemies, that girls that are kind of, they're bullying each other. They're not really nice to each other. They're not really friends. But they go to school together. Toward the middle of the book where she goes to get treatment, she finds herself needing to open up to the other women that she's in treatment with, and then she ends up forming these very close friendships with these women. And so the theme of female friendship, female empowerment, women helping women to overcome obstacles in their life, the idea that many times in terms of appearance. Women are the ones kind of tearing each other down. And I wanted a book where there were some women kind of trying to tear her down, and then there were other women really willing and wanting to build her up as they recovered themselves and became stronger. So the idea of her obsessing over this boyfriend who dumps her just didn't fit. Just didn't fit with that theme. And I didn't have that theme in mind going into writing the book. So I guess that's kind of an important thing to note. I myself had an eating disorder when I was younger. I went through a similar experience to Jessie, though not quite the same. But it certainly was inspired by my experiences. And so I should say, when I was going through that, I did not have a boyfriend either until a little bit later down the road. So that might have been part of the decision. But yeah, this idea of female empowerment and female friendship just kind of came up as I was telling the story. And I saw this thread kind of going through of like, okay, we have this. She's bullying somebody else. These girls are making fun of her. They're all calling each other fat. They're wanting to diet together. She finds this kind of comfort in these new friendships. The dynamic is totally different. They're encouraging each other. They're helping each other. They're talking about their problems and why they have these eating disorders to begin with and all of that kind of thing. So in this book, I didn't have a theme in mind. I don't have an excerpt for you from Smothered, although that book, I guess I could share an excerpt. If you want an excerpt, email me. But in that book, I really did have some themes in mind. I knew that this was, it's a murder mystery about a young girl who was a child star and she's murdered. And then we have essentially an online tabloid putting through online all of these police records and never before seen kind of things. The way that something like The Smoking Gun or BuzzFeed might do a long story on. And with that story, I wanted to have this theme of exploitation, what happens in Hollywood, especially to children, how that looks, what that works like, how people use each other in Hollywood very often. I wrote it right before the Me Too movement started, so it kind of fits in with that whole idea. And I also wanted to have a theme about how the media plays a role in that exploitation and the tone of the media, the way that we look at things kind of flippantly, even though they're very serious. There are online comments on these stories. So at the end of every chapter, you get the trolling message board people. What that looks like, how we talk about things. This is a murder that took place, and then people are trolling and putting ridiculous comments in there. And so, so with that book, I did have a theme in mind. So really, it can go kind of either way. You know, I'm asking you this week to kind of generate a theme and write a story with that theme in mind, but you don't necessarily, for your other work, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can start writing and just see where the characters take you, where the stories take you, and if you kind of see a recurring idea, some abstract concepts, and you think you might have kind of a message about those concepts, then it comes about on its own. So I talked for a little bit longer than I intended. Sorry about that, but I hope that you got something out of this, and I hope you enjoy the stories, and I hope you learned something from my mistakes. And that's it. I will see you guys next week.